This video is brought to you by pinesandmaples.ca, where you can find all sorts of great Canadian products made by Canadian creators. Enjoy!
Around the time of Hennepin's capture by the Sioux, after the mutiny at Fort Crèvecoeur, Rene-Robert Cavelier, Sieur de La Salle formed a new party and returned to the Illinois River. There, he found the grand village of the Illinois burnt to the ground. Scattered throughout the ashes were mutilated corpses and poles surmounted by human skulls. Unbeknownst to him, the disinterred inhabitants of the village cemetery. To La Salle and his crew, it appeared that an Iroquois war party had wiped out the Illinois village and massacred its inhabitants. La Salle searched the ruined village for any sign of his faithful lieutenant Henri de Tonty, but met without success. He and his men then followed the Illinois River towards its confluence with the Mississippi, in which direction it appeared the Iroquois braves had chased the fleeing survivors of the massacre. Along the way, they came across the bodies of the Illinois women and children, whom the Iroquois had tortured and partially eaten, but found no sign of Tonty. After nailing a message for his lieutenant to a tree, La Salle and his crew returned to the charred remains of Fort Miami. In spite of the failure of his most recent expedition, La Salle still hoped to bring the fur trade to the natives who inhabited the waterways south of the Great Lakes. He also realized that such an endeavor would be impossible as long as the Iroquois continued to make incursions into the area, and so he sent out emissaries to the Shawnee tribe for the purpose of forming a defensive anti-Iroquois alliance. La Salle himself led an ambassadorial expedition to the territory of the Illinois Indians. On the way, he became snowblind and was forced to stop. Shortly thereafter, while searching for an herbal remedy to his master's condition, one of La Salle's employees encountered a band of Fox Indians, who informed him that Henri de Tonty was alive and well, spending the winter with the Potawatomi Indians of Lake Michigan. When the spring of 1681 came and La Salle had recovered from his snow blindness, he and his party continued their journey into Illinois territory. There, La Salle met with the survivors of the massacre of the previous year and convinced them to ally themselves with the Miami Indians for mutual protection against the Iroquois. The explorer then proceeded to the proximate territory of the Miami Indians and convinced these natives to ally themselves with the Illinois. Pleased with his success, La Salle traveled to Michilimackinac that May, where he reunited with Tonty and other participants in the misadventure on the Illinois River. Together, La Salle and his men traveled to Fort Frontenac, where they re-outfitted and set out on yet another expedition of discovery. The French explorer and his party headed all the way to the southern end of Lake Michigan and proceeded down the Chicago River. They made the portage to the Illinois River and followed it to the abandoned remains of the great Illinois village that the Iroquois had destroyed the previous year. They continued on to the Illinois' confluence with the Mississippi and followed that great waterway southwest. On the evening of their first day on the Mississippi, they reached that river's junction with the Missouri and set up their camp on the shore nearby. In the days that followed, they paddled past the mouth of the Ohio River, drifted along the shores of a swamp, and glided by a series of promontories known today as the Chickasaw Bluffs. They made their camp in the shadow of the third of these bluffs and set out into the woods in search of game. By evening, all but one of the hunters had returned. Fearing that his lost employee, named Pierre Prudhomme, had been killed by Indians, La Salle had half of his men build a makeshift fort atop the bluff and sent the other half into the woods to search for the missing hunter. During their search, the rescue party came upon 2 Chickasaw Indians upon whom they bestowed presents and messages of peace. Several days later, they came upon a hungry and bedraggled Prudhomme, who had lost his way in the woods. In an effort to console the mortified French-Canadian, La Salle named the new bastion Fort Prudhomme. La Salle and his crew continued on down the Mississippi, rowing past swamps and wastelands. On March 13th, they found themselves enveloped in thick fog when the throb of a war drum and the war song of Indian braves erupted on one side of the river. The Frenchmen quickly paddled to the opposite shore and constructed a makeshift barricade. The fog soon cleared, and the two parties eyed each other from across the river. La Salle beckoned for the Indians to join him and his men on their side of the river, and after some deliberation amongst themselves, a handful of enterprising braves paddled over to the Frenchmen. When La Salle presented them with a peace pipe, the warriors called the rest of the band over, and soon the explorers were surrounded by friendly Quapaw Indians. Throughout the 3 days that followed their meeting, the Quapaw natives feasted with the newcomers, bringing them corn, beans, and dried fruits. At the conclusion of their hospitable reception, La Salle and his men proceeded to the center of the nearby Quapaw village, where they erected a cross bearing the French coat of arms and claimed the surrounding territory for the King of France. The explorers then took their leave of their hosts and continued down the river, accompanied by 2 Quapaw guides. On the way, they encountered and killed several large alligators, animals which none of the Frenchmen had seen before. About 100 miles below the mouth of the Arkansas River, they came to a swamp and a trail which the Quapaw said led to a great Indian village. La Salle tasked Tonty and Zenobius Mamba, the latter one of the Recollect friars, with visiting this village while he and the rest of the crew waited by the canoes. The 2 delegates arrived at the village in 2 hours and were astonished by what they saw. Instead of the haphazard collection of circular bark wigwams they had expected, Tonty and Mamba found it a well-laid-out town filled with large square buildings made from mud bricks and roofed with canvas. The explorers paid a visit to the house of the village chief and presented the leader with gifts. The chief, in turn, decided to visit La Salle and his party on the riverbank, where the latter showered more gifts on the former. The next morning, the explorers encountered another band of Indians further downriver. Although they initially brandished their bows and arrows at the sight of the newcomers, the natives warmed to the explorers when the latter made it clear that they came in peace. The Sieur de La Salle, wrote Father Mamba in a later reminiscence, whose very air, engaging manners, tact, and address attract love and respect alike, produced such an effect on the hearts of these people that they did not know how to treat us well enough. The natives took the explorers to their own village, which greatly resembled the one that Tonty and Mamba had just visited. La Salle and his men voyaged further down the river, passing 2 more Indian villages, the fearful inhabitants of one of which greeted them with a hail of arrows. Beyond this point, they came across a cluster of wigwams filled with corpses, presumably the product of an enemy raid. On April 6th, the explorers came to a 3-pronged fork in the river. La Salle split his company into thirds, assigned each division to a particular branch, and commanded his men to follow their respective waterways to the ocean. The Frenchmen all reached the Gulf of Mexico shortly thereafter and reunited. On the shores of the Atlantic, they erected a cross bearing the words, Louis the Great, King of France and Navarre, reigns, April 9, 1682. La Salle proceeded to give a speech in which he dubbed the watersheds of the Mississippi River and Ohio rivers Louisiana, in honor of the French king for whom he claimed them. The purpose of their voyage having been accomplished, La Salle and his crew began the long journey up the Mississippi, subsisting on alligators and surviving a few dangerous encounters with hostile natives. On the way, La Salle contracted some sort of illness and decided to recover at Fort Prudhomme. He tasked his faithful lieutenant, Henri de Tonty, with bringing news of their achievement to Michilimackinac. La Salle and his men resumed the journey in late July and reunited with Tonty in Michilimackinac in September. There, they learned that La Salle's great supporter, Count Frontenac, had been recalled to France for unlawfully imprisoning his deputy's teenage son. Frontenac had been succeeded as governor of New France by Joseph Antoine Lefebvre Sieur de la Barre, a French naval officer and former colonial administrator whose service in Europe, French Guiana, and the Caribbean had been colored by both stunning victories and displays of incompetence and cowardice. The explorers also learned that the Iroquois were planning to conduct another offensive against the Miami Indians. La Salle knew that he would need to prevent the outbreak of war if he ever hoped to bring the fur trade to Louisiana, and so he set out with his crew for the unfinished ruins of Fort St. Louis at Starved Rock on the Illinois River. The explorers reached the site without incident and constructed the wooden palisaded Fort St. Louis throughout December 1682. Throughout that winter and the spring of 1683, La Salle and his men maintained their somewhat shaky relationship with the Illinois and Miami Indians, through whom they had learned that the rumored Iroquois offensive was imminent. Accordingly, La Salle sent several of his men back to the French settlements along the St. Lawrence to secure ammunition and other supplies necessary for the French explorers to defend themselves and their allies. Unfortunately, these men were detained as unlicensed coureurs de bois by agents of Governor Le Barre, who, unbeknownst to La Salle, hoped to supplant Frontenac's virtual monopoly of the fur trade with his own. La Salle refused to leave Fort St. Louis to deal with the situation in person, fearing that if the Iroquois attacked the local natives in his absence, his Illinois and Miami friends might think that he was behind the attack. Instead, he sent letters to Le Barre in which he asked the governor to release his men and allow them to bring back ammunition and reinforcements. Instead of complying with La Salle's request, Labarre seized all of La Salle's assets, including Fort Frontenac, which he claimed was undermanned. Realizing now that the governor was determined to destroy his enterprise, La Salle waited out the summer at Fort St. Louis before traveling back to Quebec with the intention of sailing for France and obtaining support from the king. On the way, he met a French military officer named Louis-Henri de Bougy, whom Labarre had sent to seize Fort St. Louis. Subduing his anger, La Salle sent a letter to Tonty, instructing him to comply with the officer's directive before he himself continued on to France. La Salle boarded the ship Saint Honoré and sailed across the Atlantic to the city of La Rochelle. From there he traveled to the Palace of Versailles, where he was approached by an old acquaintance, an abbot named Claude Bernoux, who invited him to take part in a dangerous scheme he had contrived. Prior to his departure, La Salle had learned that Labarre and his enemies in New France had already informed the king of his voyage down the Mississippi and had done their best to portray it in a negative light. Their efforts apparently succeeded, as the king, in a letter to Labarre, dismissed La Salle's voyage of discovery as utterly useless, and ordered the delighted governor to prevent similar expeditions in the future. Although he suspected he would have little luck convincing the king to sanction his endeavors on the Mississippi on the merit of his discoveries alone, he had resolved to try anyways.